the time Wall Street tried to overthrow the U.S. government. How one general stopped a banker's army. The year is 1933, and something unthinkable is happening in America. We believe democracy fell to foreign armies, to ideological movements, to charismatic dictators crossing borders with tanks. But that's not how republics die. They die in hotel lobbies, in handshake deals, in briefcases full of cash. They die when the men who own the steel and control the gold decide the Constitution is bad for business. This is the story of the business plot. This is the story of how American millionaires tried to buy a coup. And this is the story of the one man who said no. The Great Depression wasn't just poverty. It was the wholesale liquidation of the American dream, a foreclosure on an entire nation's future. 25% of American men had no job, no income, no dignity. Factories stood silent like tombstones in the industrial heartland. Smokestacks went cold while families burned furniture to stay warm through the winter. Farmers let their fields turn to dust because the market price for wheat had collapsed below the cost of harvesting it. In the cities, men in expensive suits stood on corners selling apples for 5 cents. These weren't drifters or drunks. These were accountants, stockbrokers, managers, men who had believed the system worked. Their hands shook as they held out their merchandise to strangers who couldn't afford to buy. Their eyes were hollow, stripped of hope, stripped of the illusion that hard work mattered when the entire financial system had collapsed. In every major city, shanty towns sprang up like infections. They called them Hoovervilles, named with bitter irony after President Herbert Hoover, the man who had watched the economy burn. Families lived in shelters made of cardboard, scrap metal, and shattered expectations. Children with swollen bellies from malnutrition played in the mud. Men who had once owned homes now waited in breadlines that stretched for blocks. The social contract was broken. The promise that capitalism and democracy could deliver prosperity was exposed as a lie. People were starving in the richest country on earth. Malnutrition diseases that had been eradicated were returning. Suicide rates climbed. The fabric holding society together was unraveling thread by thread. And in the marble halls of Wall Street, in the boardrooms of the great banks, in the private clubs where only millionaires could enter, a different kind of panic was setting in. The bankers and industrialists who actually ran America were terrified. Not of poverty, they would never be poor, but of revolution. They watched the breadlines grow longer. They saw the anger building in the eyes of the unemployed. They read reports of violent strikes and labor unrest. They genuinely believed the mob was coming for them. They believed the guillotine was being sharpened, that the French Revolution was about to replay itself on American soil. Their nightmares were filled with visions of their own mansions being burned, their own heads in baskets. Then, in March of 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt walked onto the stage. To the poor and desperate, he was a savior. In his inaugural address, he spoke the words that would define an era. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. He promised a New Deal, bold government action to feed the hungry and employ the jobless. He promised hope. But to the wealthy elite, Roosevelt was something far more sinister. He was a traitor to his class. Franklin Roosevelt came from old money, from American aristocracy. The Roosevelts were royalty. He had attended the finest schools. He should have been defending their interests, protecting their wealth. Instead, he had turned against his own kind. When Roosevelt took the United States off the gold standard in April of 1933, he devalued the dollar to help farmers and debtors. But he also cost the banks millions overnight. Bonds they held lost half their value in a single stroke. The bankers felt robbed by their own government. When Roosevelt started talking about Social Security, minimum wage laws, banking regulations, taxing the wealthy to fund public works, the tycoons saw it as communism in disguise. To them, freedom meant the freedom to do business without interference. Roosevelt's New Deal looked like the end of American capitalism as they understood it. Let that sink in. The men who controlled the steel, the oil, the railroads, the banks, they believed their president was destroying the country. And in the smoke-filled private clubs of New York, a whisper began to circulate. A whisper that perhaps Roosevelt needed to be stopped. Not by election, they had lost that battle, but by force, by coup, by installing a government that would protect their profits. This is where Smedley Darlington Butler enters the story. In 1933, Butler was not just a soldier. He was a legend. He was the most decorated Marine in the history of the United States Marine Corps. He had received the Medal of Honor twice. Only 19 men in American history had ever achieved that. He had performed acts of extraordinary heroism that most men couldn't imagine. Butler was born a Quaker, a pacifist by heritage, which made his career a profound contradiction. From this tradition of nonviolence came one of the greatest warriors America ever produced. He had lied about his age to join the Marines at 16. He had fought in the Philippines, in China during the Boxer Rebellion, in the Banana Wars of Central America, in the trenches of France during World War I. The troops under his command loved him with an intensity that bordered on worship. They called him Old Gimlet Eye because of his piercing stare. He was a soldier's soldier. He didn't lead from the back. He lived in the mud with his men. He slept in the trenches. He ate the same terrible food. He shared their dangers. When his men died, he wept. But by 1933, something had changed inside Butler. He had spent 33 years serving the flag, following orders, doing his duty. But when he retired and finally had time to reflect, he didn't see glory. He saw a racket. He saw a con game. He saw himself as an enforcer for corporate interests. He realized with bitter clarity that in almost every conflict he had fought, the United States military had not been fighting for freedom or democracy. It had been fighting for money, for corporate profits, for the financial interests of wealthy men who never risked their own lives. He had invaded Haiti to protect the profits of National City Bank. He had invaded Nicaragua to protect Brown Brothers Brokerage. He had invaded Honduras to protect United Fruit Company's banana plantations. The American flag had been planted and men had died so corporations could extract wealth from poor countries. This realization broke something in Butler, but it also freed him. He began to speak out with moral courage that was rare. He traveled the country giving speeches that shocked the establishment. He told audiences that war was a racket conducted for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. He said he had been a high-class muscle man for big business, a gangster for capitalism. The bankers on Wall Street knew who Smedley Butler was. They knew his reputation. They knew he was a hero to the veterans. They knew that if Butler told the soldiers to march, the soldiers would march. But they didn't listen to what he was actually saying. They didn't hear the content of his speeches. They only saw the surface. They saw the medals. They saw the rank. They assumed he thought like them. That arrogance, that fundamental misunderstanding of who Butler really was, would be their undoing. The plot began quietly in July of 1933. Butler was retired, living in his modest farmhouse in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. He was 52 years old, trying to find peace. A heavy black limousine pulled up his driveway. It was an incongruous sight. Two men got out. One was Bill Doyle, someone Butler knew from veteran circles. The other was Gerald McGuire, a bond salesman Butler had never met. McGuire was heavy-set with a round face and a slippery smile. He worked for Grayson M.P. Murphy and Company, one of the most prestigious brokerage firms on Wall Street. Colonel Grayson Murphy was extraordinarily powerful with connections throughout the highest levels of American business. He sat on the boards of Goodyear and Bethlehem Steel. He was a director at Guarantee Trust Company, controlled by the J.P. Morgan Empire. McGuire was smooth, the kind of man who could sell ice in the Arctic. He walked into Butler's home with easy confidence. He sat down, accepted a drink, and started talking about the veterans. At the time, veterans of World War I were suffering terribly. The government had promised them a bonus for their service, but the payment had been delayed until 1945, over a decade away. The veterans needed that money now. They were starving. McGuire told Butler he represented wealthy, concerned citizens who wanted to help the veterans. They wanted Butler to speak at an American Legion convention in Chicago. They wanted him to demand the government pay the soldiers in gold, not worthless paper money. Butler's instincts immediately started screaming warnings. He was suspicious. Why would the American Legion, controlled by conservative establishment forces, want a firebrand like him to speak? And why did they specifically care about gold? McGuire, sensing hesitation, opened his briefcase with a theatrical flourish. Inside was $18,000 in cash. In 1933, when working men made a few dollars a week, $18,000 was a staggering fortune. McGuire pushed the money across the table. He said it was for expenses. He wanted Butler to take paid supporters to Chicago to help rig the convention. Butler looked at the money. He looked at the sweating bond salesman. His combat instincts flared like an alarm. This wasn't about veterans. Veterans didn't have $18,000 in cash. This was about something else, something dangerous. Butler made a decision. He would play along. He wanted to know who was behind this. He pushed the money back, but didn't say no. Over the next several months, Gerald McGuire became a frequent visitor. He courted Butler with patience and gifts. He took him to fancy dinners, invited him to luxury hotels, bought him drinks. And slowly, piece by piece, he began to reveal the true nature of his mission. The gold issue was the key. McGuire explained that the men he worked for were furious that Roosevelt had taken the country off the gold standard. These men held millions in bonds whose value was tied to gold. When Roosevelt devalued the dollar, those bonds lost half their value overnight. The bankers felt robbed, but it went deeper than money. It was about power. McGuire started talking about the state of the country with barely controlled panic. He said democracy was failing. The masses were too stupid to govern themselves. Roosevelt was destroying American society with his radical experiments. What America needed was a change, a fundamental change. Then McGuire said something that made Butler's blood run cold. He told Butler he had been sent to Europe. His bosses had paid for him to travel first class to Italy, Germany, and France. But he wasn't studying art or architecture. He was studying fascism. He was studying paramilitary organizations. He was studying how to overthrow democracy. McGuire spoke with admiration about a group called the Croix de Feu in France, the Cross of Fire. It was a right-wing organization of military veterans who operated as a private army. They had marched on the French Parliament in a show of force. They were disciplined and willing to use violence. McGuire said America needed its own Croix de Feu. He said the police couldn't handle the growing social unrest. The National Guard was unreliable. The country needed what he called a super-organization of veterans, a private army loyal not to the president, not to the Constitution, but to the leaders of business, an army that would protect property and profits. And they needed a leader. They needed a man on a white horse. They needed Smedley Butler. Butler sat there listening to this bond salesman outline treason against the United States. His face remained stone. Inside, rage was building, but he kept asking questions. Who is paying for this? How many men can you recruit? What is the plan? McGuire, interpreting Butler's questions as interest, got excited. He started naming names. Real names of real people. He said the money was there. They had raised $3 million with commitments for $30 million more. $30 million in 1933 was an incomprehensible fortune. He mentioned the Singer sewing machine family. He mentioned Rockefeller interests. But the biggest name he dropped was J.P. Morgan, the most powerful bank in America, perhaps in the world. McJ told Butler that a new organization had been formed called the American Liberty League. On paper, it was a political advocacy group defending the Constitution from Roosevelt's overreach, but McGuire said it was a front. The American Liberty League was the financial engine that would power the coup. The American Liberty League was absolutely real. It had been formed in August of 1934 by the wealthiest men in America. Its members included leaders of General Motors, General Foods, and the DuPont chemical empire. These men literally owned the steel, oil, and railroads of America. They felt their kingdom was threatened by a socialist in the White House, a traitor to his class. McGuire laid out the plan in chilling detail. They would recruit 500,000 men, 500,000 soldiers. They would use the American Legion as the recruiting base. Then they would break away to form a new paramilitary organization. They would arm them with rifles and ammunition. The weapons would come from Remington Arms, controlled by DuPont. It was all in the family, McGuire said. This army would march on Washington in a massive show of force. It would not be violent, at least not at first. It would be a demonstration of overwhelming power. They would surround the White House. They would demand an audience with Roosevelt. Butler asked what they would say to the president. McGuire smiled. They would be polite and respectful. They would tell him the job was too much, that his health was failing. They would suggest he needed help. They would propose creating a new position, a Secretary of General Affairs. This secretary would take over all executive powers. He would run the Army, Navy, and economy. Roosevelt would remain president in name only, a figurehead. The real power would lie with the secretary. It was exactly Mussolini's model. The King of Italy was still on the throne, but Il Duce ran the country. Democracy would exist on paper, but be a hollow shell. McGuire looked Butler in the eye. You are the man to be secretary. You will be the dictator of the United States. Butler felt cold rage threatening to explode. He looked at this soft man in his expensive suit, casually discussing the destruction of the Republic like a business merger. Butler wanted to snap his neck, but he knew killing McGuire wouldn't solve anything. McGuire was just a messenger. If he died, they would find another general. Someone like Douglas MacArthur, with his massive ego and authoritarian tendencies. Butler realized he had to be smart. He had to become a spy in his own country. He had to let the conspiracy unfold enough to expose it completely, but not so far it succeeded. He told McGuire he was interested. The lie tasted like poison, but he said he needed proof. He couldn't take the word of a bond salesman. He needed to see the men at the top. McGuire arranged a meeting with Robert Sterling Clark. Clark was an heir to the Singer fortune, born into wealth so vast he had never worked. He was a millionaire many times over. The meeting took place at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia, one of the grandest hotels in America. The lobby dripped with wealth, crystal chandeliers, marble floors, gilded fixtures. Clark didn't believe in subtlety. He got straight to the point. He told Butler he was willing to spend half his fortune to save the other half. He said if Roosevelt kept messing with the currency, the country would descend into ruin. He confirmed everything McGuire had said. He confirmed the money was available, the weapons could be procured. They were looking for a strong man. He even tried to bribe Butler right there in the lobby. He pulled out his checkbook and offered to write a check for tens of thousands of dollars. Butler refused, but he had what he needed. A second witness. Confirmation this wasn't McGuire's fantasy. Because Butler had been smart, he had brought a reporter named Paul Comley French. French wrote for the Philadelphia Record and New York Post. Butler had introduced him as his secretary. Clark and McGuire had assumed he was just a lackey and spoken freely. French took meticulous notes. He wrote down names and amounts. He wrote down the most chilling quote. McGuire had said without shame, "We need a fascist government in this country to save the nation from the communists." There it was. Fascism in America funded by American millionaires. Armed with evidence and witnesses, Butler was ready to strike. But who could he tell? The police were controlled by politicians in the pockets of these wealthy men. The newspapers were owned by industrialists. It was a closed system of corruption.